welcome to The Nation. I'm Jessy Chahal. In this edition, and in conjunction with the upcoming National Day observance and celebration, Merdeka, we embark on a journey through time and politics, celebrating the remarkable legacy of an eminent figure, the late Tun Dr. Ismael Abdul Rahman. Of course, fresh from the celebration of his 100th birth anniversary, we continue to honour this visionary man. Joining me in the studio is none other than the Executive Director of the Penang Institute of and a political historian, DATO Dr. Ooi Kee Beng. DATO, welcome to the studio. Indeed a pleasure to meet you. We had the opportunity to speak a little bit off air, but here we are. And one thing that really strikes me is your appreciation and your passion for not just history, but this particular special person. Do walk us through, take us through the beginning of how these three books came about.
Well, first, history is important because it's important to the here and now. It's not the past. And actually, if you don't understand history, you don't understand what's going on today, really. Well, speaking as a historian, of course. And what you said in the beginning about Tun Dr. Ismaels' legacy, I would start by saying that I think a lot of his legacy, the full impact of his legacy has not been felt because he died early and it sort of got forgotten. And I would say that when the book project started, this is 2006, most Malaysians had forgotten him. I'm of the age where, I was born in 1955, so when Tun Dr. Ismael was in his heyday, after the May 13 rioting and so on, I still remember him on TV. I still remember him as the tough guy. He was the man who fixed things, That's what I remember of him. And then I lived overseas all my life, and then when I came back to the region, and here was the project for me.
Yeah.
So in a way, I thought the stars were aligning themselves for a book about him to come into being. And so it did. And it was a big hit when it came out. A lot of leading Malaysian leaders in the mass media and retired politicians quickly got very excited, including Sultan Nasrin of Perak. He was Raja then. He's the one, I think, who's bought the most copies.
Right.
Musa Hitam was involved. Kalimullah Hassan of New Straits Times. He was a great help. Once the book came out, he serialized the book for 7 days on the New Straits Times. So I think a lot of people didn't buy the book because they thought they had read the whole book.
Yeah. But when you do walk into bookstores today, you still see this very much, prominent.
But they're not doing an extra print because the demand isn't strong enough. But I'm hoping that with the attention given it by the Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, recently, that people will get interested again and want to be reminded of what his legacy actually is, Tun Dr. Ismael's legacy. Yeah?
He was, of course, looked upon as a disciplinarian. He was very strict about his ways, staunch in his beliefs as well. We had his son here not too long ago walking us through some of his early childhood memories. And likewise, you too watched him on TV growing up, and little did you know at that point that you would be writing about him. And of course, this award-winning book right here really puts in ink exactly what were his thoughts and his sentiments during that. You had the opportunity to work with some of the people that were working with him as well, and had a look as well at some of his private papers.
Well, the book is based. It's one of those rare books where Malaysia is concerned. It's actually based on his papers. Now most Malaysian leaders don't seem to have private papers, but he did. Because he was a thinker and philosophical in many ways, I suppose. So the book is based on his papers, on secondary literature, and most importantly on interviews. Many of the interviewees, they were made available to me by Taufik, Dr. Ismael. We had a lot of fun writing the book. He was living in Johor Bahru then, so we went up and down quite often, over 18 months or so. We went to Hong Kong even, or at least I did. I don't think Taufik went, to talk to Robert Kwok. In Singapore, we had a good chat, or I did, with Lee Kuan Yew. So some of these interviews were great. They gave insight that we otherwise wouldn't have had. And a lot of civil servants who later became very important, who worked under Tun Dr. Ismael, including Chet Singh, for example, who's now based in Penang, who was based in Penang. So it was a great, for me, a Malaysian born and raised and so on, a great lesson in what Malaysian nation building was supposed to be in the first 20 years or so. So the book, I think today, with the new attention paid to him, I hope will be not only a reminder for what Merdeka was about, but what we expected and knew we could achieve.
As a Malaysian who had spent so many of your adult years overseas, coming back then to also write the book, what resonated with you so much? What really stuck with you?
Going back to that, well, I've always been born in 1955. I think I came at the tail end of the Merdeka period, right? So I was born the subject of the Queen, if you like, but then grew up as a Malaysian in a way. And so I was always fascinated by these people who were slightly older than me. And later on in my studies in politics and so on, and nation building throughout the world, that was my great interest, or still is. Who were these people? Why were they so dedicated and so on? It could be in many countries, in the Merdeka period or in the post-war period throughout the world. You had a lot of people who decided they were going to build a new nation and so on. So the term nation building became a third world concept, and Malaysia is part of this, right? And what fascinated me now, I've written a few books on this, I call them first generation leaders, yeah? Be it Singapore or Malaysia. There's something different about them that people from my generation and later on have no idea about.
What's that?
A sense of fate, a sense of destiny. I think Tun Dr. Ismael definitely had it. Today, Tun Mahathir definitely had it. But his life had been so long, so we won't talk about that now. But if you were born in the 20s, 30s, maybe even early 40s, you were bitten by a certain bug, right? A nation-building bug. And so this sense that you were born to help out, to build a world, a rather localized world, given that the imperial and the colonial powers had now retreated. So what's to take their space? So it's all this idea of nation-states being built, and Malaysia is one of those, of course.
There was a direct spirit for that. There was a sense of responsibility. Responsibility,
definitely. And I study Malaysian politics a lot and Malaysian history a lot. We think of the first era and we think of Tunku Abdul Rahman and Raza. Most people will think of Tunku and Raza.
Yeah.
Ismail has sort of faded because he died so early, but not to a certain age of Malaysians. We do know that he existed, and I think the book is a very good reminder. I would not because I wrote it, but I would suggest that Malaysians read it. It's in Malay as well.
Right.
It's full of the details, and if you read it now, I call it the reluctant politician. I'm trying to. There are two parts to this: the politician and whoever it is that's not the politician.
We'll come back to that just after this quick messages. Do stay tuned. We'll be right back. You're watching The Nation right here on Bernama TV. Welcome back to The Nation with me, Jessy Chahal, and joining me in the studio, Dr. Uiki Beng, Executive Director from the Penang Institute, as well as a political historian. You say that you perhaps could also be called an analyst or an observer, and those terms are quite shifting, given that you've had so much of interaction and experience with the Malaysian landscape. What would you say about how things have changed from then to now?
Well, things have changed, but there is a trajectory to it. And of course, as a historian, when you look back, you do see lines, right? So it always looks rational. But then there could have been other alternatives, and there were alternatives that became something else, and so on and so forth. And that's what's interesting about political history, especially if you look at the biographies. Now, I think of biographies as the real alternative histories, right? You have the official history that nobody's happy with, and then of course we want an alternative history. But I think the best way to have alternative histories, there is no shortcut for the reader. He has to read a lot if he wants to have alternative histories. And I think biographies, especially of political leaders, if done academically,
Right.
not done as some hagiographic product, it's a good way to tell young Malaysians what Malaysia is all about.
You say that this book has sort of two thought processes or two parts to it. Tell us a bit about that. The reluctant politician.
There's a reason why it's called The Reluctant Politician. I think I chose the right title.
It's a catchy title indeed, yes.
It's about politicians, so we have a certain image of what politicians are, right?
Right.
But here's a reluctant one. So there's something else to it. There's a person here. And I think if we read the book carefully, and here we have a chance to read of a Malaysian leader, a very important Malaysian leader, and his life. We've hardly had that kind of story
Focus,
before.
yeah.
And here was, if you ask me, perhaps the most important person in trying to work out and think out how Malaysia should be, not only internally but also globally. He was the man behind our policy of neutrality, one of the guys who pushed for ASEAN and so on. So here's a man who was all over the place. So he was in internal affairs, he was in external affairs, he was home affairs, he was our ambassador to the United Nations, ambassador to US, our first, and that's what this book is all about. Right?
Well, it's his first year at the United Nations.
Yeah, so he was involved in many aspects. I would say, exaggerating slightly, that he would be our Gawking Sui. Singapore's Gawking Sui was the man who did a lot of thinking, built a lot of institutions. Now, of course, Ismael's story is not totally about that, but to some extent you could see that behind the top two, you had number three who actually influenced them greatly through his loyalty, through his dedication, and so on.
As a leader, what was his main or his vision? What was his focus?
Good question. I was going to talk something about that. When you said earlier that he's known as a disciplinarian, didn't stand fools and so on, all that is true, but then there are many people like that, right? But there's something else to him. There was a certain purpose to everything, and it was a purpose he reluctantly had to get into because the times required him to become a politician. So when he came back from Australia, he was, by the way, the first Malay to become a doctor, trained in Queen's College, Melbourne. He came back in 1946, hoping to become a doctor in Johor Bahru and become rich and so on, right? But UMNO was being formed. He didn't quite like the initial UMNO and so on. It was only after Tunku decided to take over the UMNO that he thought, okay, now here's the leader I can follow. So if we think of what was driving him, I think that he came back and he realized the times required that he gave up all that difficult studying. He didn't seem to be a natural scholar. He had some difficulties in doing what he did. He had to work really hard when he was in Australia. His family, although from a privileged group, still could not really afford to pay for everything for him. So he had to be rather stingy in his 6 years in Australia. And I think when he came back, so this character of his that everyone talks about, it's important to us because it was given a very strong purpose, and this was the nation-building idea. He realized Malaysia was coming into being, and it had to be built a certain way, and he felt he had a lot to contribute to that, right? And working under the Tunku, he could do it, and so he did. And if one reads the book, one could see the struggle of the individual. That's what I want to get to, the reluctancy. And a leader is not born. A leader chooses to become a leader politically. He chooses to be that. And to him, you want to be a political leader, you better do it not for the money, you better have a profession first so that you're not dependent on your political pay, which was what he had his choices. He could always become a doctor.
As reluctant as he was, what really drove him? Because we do also see national issues at this point, and yet that sense of drive perhaps is not as apparent as we see.
I suppose in his case, one could
Ismael.
simplify it, not talk too big about global nation building and so on. His father was not a pushover. His father was a rather defiant, recalcitrant person who led a group in Johor against the Menteri Besar and the Sultan for agreeing to the Malayan Union. And so he was a part of a group that got kicked out and so on. So the family is of that type. And also the father was one of those very progressive Malay privileged people, if I put it that way, educated anyway, who decided that all his children must be properly educated. And so a lot of his savings just went to make sure that all his children would get educated. Right? So in Malaysian politics, we have him. I think he was the first, what do you call it, chairman of the Senate and so on. Then you have Sulaiman and Ismael as his sons, who became very important in the early history of Malaya and Malaysia.
That's right. We take another quick break at this point, Dato, as we celebrate the 100th birth anniversary of Dr. Ismael. We continue to honour this visionary statesman. 3 books here written by Dato, definitely noteworthy, and as Dato is here to remind us that it serves as a guide to what was and what can still be for Malaysia. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back. Today we honour Dr. Ismael and look back at his commitment, his care for the country, his love for the country, but also his strong beliefs that benefited Malaysia or Malaya at that point in so many aspects. He then also embarked on his own educational journey, including studying in Australia, which really helped shape his worldview. He was also pivotal in the development of Rukun Negara, which then further drove the importance of unity here in our nation. Dato, what would you tell us a little bit about his advocacy for education?
I think it's in the family. It's something he got from his father. And so his whole family was very much dedicated to education. And so with a lot of sacrifice, he managed to get into Melbourne University, and he studied there at Queen's College. And because of the war and so on, he stayed there altogether 6 years, including working in a hospital there. And I think that was very formative. And I think it's important in the Malaysian context to mention that among the top leaders, the first generation of leaders who practically all went to England, not him, he went to Australia. And I think that does make a difference because he was very alone. There were Malaysians, but he was the only Malay, I think, for a long time. And he always had a heart problem, and so and the Australians are very physical people. The culture is very physical and joy-loving and so on. So in those reading the book will see that he also had his share of enjoying himself. But he was, he knew that his family was sacrificing for him and so on. The character building, I would put it that way, during those years is quite obvious.
And that was reflective because it really perhaps influenced his approach after May 69 to restore stability and to maintain fairness. This was a difficult time for the nation.
It's a study in becoming a fair person. Now, everyone says he's known for his fairness and all that. Now, how does a person become so dedicated to fairness? That's what I was getting at. The character building of his years in Australia, I think, shouldn't be underestimated. And so when he came back and decided to go into politics, and everything worked out, they actually gained independence, and there he was right in the middle of things. And just, of course, just when he thought that he was going to start building the nation, the Tunku sent him to the US. And some of his friends said that this was a kind of banishment for something or other.
Right.
But he didn't quite believe that, so he agreed to go anyway. So he did a lot. He's known for the only person, or the first, if you like, person to ever walk into the UN General Assembly carrying weapons, right? Because he was arguing about the emergency, and he carried a kris and so on. So he sort of gave that first image to the world of what Malaysia actually was.
He's also been
not a pushover.
Yeah, not a pushover. He's been called as, or referred to as, the man who saved Malaysia. But he was also staunch in his beliefs, and had this vision of a united and harmonious Malaysia. Go back to the fundamentals or the principles of Rukun Negara, in which he was very much involved with and helped shape. But how does that all tie in with where we are today? We talk about unity in diversity, to have a non-ethnic approach, if you will.
Now, he belonged to a time when Malaysian leaders still believe strongly that Malaysia has to be multicultural, multiracial, and as you know, he actually had retired because of his bad health. That's part of the reluctance. So his reluctance happened twice. He had to give up his clinic, and then he retired and was doing very well because he had friends who helped him, and he was useful as a corporate person and so on. And then with May 13, he had to be called back again. So he sacrificed twice, and he knew that he might not survive the whole ordeal. If we talk about him saving the nation, of course we can't say he's the only person, because Raza has his role to play. So we have to think of the Raza Ismael period.
If we look back, what have been some of the lessons we can really pick out from his time, and how are they relevant today?
I think many of these lessons are forgotten.
Yeah.
And I think if he came back today, he would be a very angry person. He'll probably have another heart attack. Oh, definitely will have another heart attack, because so many of the things he was afraid would happened. There were two things he was afraid of in his early years in politics that Malaysia would suffer from. One was communism, and of course we managed that. The whole world managed that. The second thing was communalism. He was very afraid that communalism would take over in Malaysia, and thereof you can understand the Rukun Negara. You can understand why he very quickly forced democracy with Raza, of course. And
to counter his anger, what would you say to him today?
What I would say to him to counter his anger, I would
research,
just agree with his anger.
Right.
Because so much promise has gone to naught. I'm not saying that everything failed, but for example, the NEP, I'm sure he had a lot to do with it. And I'm one of those people who think that the NEP document is actually quite radical. It's a clever thing. It's a worthy project. It's a mix between left and right. You have to fight poverty at the same time. There's a racial aspect to everything, right? But he put that into place. The Malay community needed help, affirmative action, and I think most people agreed with that. But he made a big thing out of it very often, that one must understand affirmative action for the majority as a golf game. It is a handicap system. Otherwise, you're in trouble. Right. You see the intellectual brinkmanship being played here, because that needed to be done. You needed to put the second Malaysia plan into place, the NEP into place, but it cannot keep going until people misunderstand the whole thing.
That's right. While we discuss Tun Dr. Ismael today, and we are reminded of his passion and his love for Malaysia, this also serves as a reminder to us to revisit history and use it as a guide as we move forward towards nation building. A great reminder as we embrace Merdeka not too far from where we are today. That has been our conversation right here in the studio. Dr. Uliki Beng joining me, Jessy Chahal. Thank you so much for being with us. Keep it locked on to Bernama TV for more. See you next time. Bye.